Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Lovely to see so many of you making it live again today, as always. Great to be with you. And this is our 7th CQC Well-Led webinar that we've put on this year for you from the Well-Led provider. This one focusing on learning, improvement and innovation, which is the 7th quality statement under the Well-Led key question. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Claire Sieber. I'm a GP. And I run the Well-Led provider with a team that you will meet shortly. And today we'll follow the usual structure that we do for these webinars, where we will give you some information about what this quality statement means, how people are faring with their CQC inspections to date this year. We will unpick the quality statement then and talk through each element and give you some examples of good and not so good practice from recent reports so that you can then make sure you're doing that or not doing that to hit good yourselves. We will then put our former practice manager and GP partner in a hot seat and let them have a gentle toasting from Gabby, our former CQC inspector. I will briefly run through the Well-Led providers' products and services and how they might help you with this quality statement in particular, and then we'll have a section for questions and answers. The webinar is being recorded, and by being present today or by being registered, you will receive an email afterwards once the recording is ready to be viewed on our YouTube channel. And from that link, you will also be able to click on a link to download the slides. So there's no need to be making copious notes, and some of the slides are quite word heavy because of the nature of compliance. So you'll be able to peruse those in your own time afterwards. Let me just run through who you're going to meet today over the course of the webinar. I've introduced myself already, but we've got Gabby Ashton with us, who is our former CQC inspector and our CQC expert, and she'll be doing the majority of this webinar. And later on, you'll meet Gary, who's our former practice manager, who works with me doing some of our workshops and making sure that everybody that uses our software is getting the most out of it. You'll also meet Dr. Ketan Bhatt, who is a GP partner and also wears lots of other hats, including being a mediator and delivering some mediation services for the Well-Led provider too. And then right at the end, you'll get to meet Rashad and Fahad, who are both clinical pharmacists from the medicines management team, who kindly hear and make sure that these webinars remain free to everyone. So thank you to them. So without further ado, Gabby, I'll hand over to you to take us through some of the recent statistics.
Great, thanks, Claire. Hi, everybody. Lovely to see you all, as Claire said. So for those of you who have joined these webinars over the year, and for those of you who haven't, what we do very quickly is look at the reports that are published on the CQC website, looking at both GP practices and adult social care homes. As we know, we've got audiences from both on the webinar. So the data is pretty much running on trend in terms of, unfortunately, the very low number and this month 0 outstanding services in GP practices that we've seen. These percentages and these numbers don't tend to fluctuate sort of above 2 or 3 each month. So this isn't particularly new data, but it is something for us to consider when we are working towards outstanding. It's always recommended when we meet with providers and when we work with services to have a look at the reports that are published on the CQC website and have a look in particular at the ones that have been given an outstanding rating, so that you can extract some of the learning from that and some of the best practice recommendations that the CQC are then awarding outstanding ratings for. Good to see quite a high percentage of good services across both sectors this month, and actually what that's done is then reduce the percentages of requires improvement and inadequate services that we're seeing. It's also interesting, I think, to look at the number of GP practices versus care home reports. We're seeing that adult social care are having a significantly higher number of inspections done over the course of a year or a month compared to primary medical services. And I suppose that's worth bearing in mind when you are a newly registered service and you're thinking about the rate at which your first inspection might come or follow-up inspections if you've experienced any enforcement action. So for primary medical care, it is still much lower in terms of the CQC's capacity to get out at the moment and do those inspections. So if we move on to the next slide, as Claire's mentioned, and as you all know, we're looking at the 7th out of eight quality statements under the well-led key question, and this one is learning, improvement and innovation. So for anybody that's been listening throughout the year or has met me or any CQC inspector probably, you'll know that lessons learned is one of our favourite phrases, one of our favourite things to talk about. It really covers everything that you do day to day. So when we're looking at the policies that you have in place, when we're looking at the audits that you're doing, when we're looking at conversations that you're having with your workforce, with your patients, with record keeping, with staff engagement, with managing complaints, receiving compliments, everything that comes into a service and essentially is then going out again to improve the quality of care for people can all be linked back to learning, improvement and innovation, and what it is that you're doing with the information you're receiving to then create better outcomes for people. So as we work through this webinar, what we're actually going to do is encourage you to, we've kind of cherry picked some of the best parts or the most well received parts or some of the feedback we've had over the webinars this year, and we'll encourage you to go back and actually look at some of the other webinars that we've covered under the quality statements under this key question, because learning, improvement and innovation has actually been covered sort of, you know, inadvertently throughout all the conversations we've been having over the year. So specifically for this key question, I've sort of highlighted the 4 key things that we, oh sorry Claire, if we just go back one, yeah, thank you. So the 4 key kind of words that we can extract from this quality statement, which is looking at learning, innovation, improvement and research. Research tends to be linked to all the 3 above, so we won't go into too much detail in that, but we will focus specifically on some top tips for how you can demonstrate compliance under those learning, innovation and improvement areas. And as always, we encourage you to make yourself aware and to feel very, very confident with your understanding of the fundamental standards or the legislation that underpins the way that the CQC work. Although we have the new single assessment framework and we have the quality statements, we have the evidence categories, we have this new approach that the inspectors are taking, the one thing that we always say hasn't changed is the legislation and the fundamental standards. So if you feel confident with those and if you use those to underpin the work that you do, then the rest should follow in a good manner. So we'll be focusing today on Regulation 17, which is good governance, and hopefully everybody knows that that features very, very heavily in the well-led key question. And then we're also looking at Regulation 16, which is receiving and acting on complaints. So if we go to the next slide, this here is Regulation 17. So all I've done here for you is extract some of the key parts of the legislation that relate specifically to this key question of learning, improvement and innovation. So we can see here that the CQC are signposting us and telling us that the importance of feedback, so that all feedback should be listened to, recorded and responded to as appropriate. That sounds like it should sit in Regulation 16, which is complaints, but it actually also does feature in the good governance element from a CQC perspective. And here again, we can see that the information you receive, as I've spoken about, should be analysed and used to drive improvement. So it's really that second part that we want, that the CQC want to be seeing. It's all very well receiving data, receiving information, being aware of things that are either going well or not well within your clinic, but it's what you're doing as a result of that information to then drive improvement. That's really where the key step is and where we often see providers fall short. We can see here providers must have effective governance, including assurance and auditing systems. So again, sometimes often we will see that the audit process isn't as robust as we would like it to be, which means the information captured isn't always consistent. It might not be up to date, it might not be accurate, and then again nothing's being done with it in a robust and sort of consistent manner to then drive improvement. So making sure that you feel confident with your own auditing systems or processes. They don't have to be complicated. That's something that we're always speaking to providers about, is yes, there is lots of technology out there, there are a huge amount of platforms. Sometimes we can see that people go overboard with procurement and actually they lose sight of what the fundamental objective of an audit is. and it really is about learning and improving the quality of care for people. So it doesn't always have to be overly difficult, and that's something that, you know, we know that the well-led provider that Claire will talk to you a little bit about later can offer you is a very, very user-friendly and accessible platform to drive improvement and capture the data. And another thing we talk about when we talk about the, you know, kind of closing the loop and closing the circle with information that you receive is then communicating how feedback has led to improvements. So once you've made changes, once you've made improvements within your service, people, so whether that be service users, patients, members of the community, other stakeholders that you might refer onwards to or work closely with, and of course your workforce, you know, your internal workforce, they all need to know and be communicated with in a really clear way about the information that they've given you and what you've done with it to drive improvements. So just thinking about that all the time. Are you closing the loop? Are you closing the circle? Is everything, you know, being managed in that way? There we go, Regulation 17. So then if we move on to the next slide, please, which is Regulation 16. Thank you, Claire. Receiving and acting on complaints. So this is the second part of the fundamental standards that the CQC signpost you to. Again, this is really making it clear that people can make a complaint or provide any feedback. It doesn't have to be a formal complaint. It can be a low-level concern. It could be a compliment, could be a suggestion for improvement. But people need to be able to raise a concern or a complaint about their care and treatment. So what that means from a CQC point of view is, what are your systems and processes? Obviously, you need a policy, making sure that that's up to date and reflective of how it is that your service is going to work. So do you have a complaints form? Is it available via your website? You know, are paper versions available in the service if people need? Can people make complaints or provide feedback in an accessible way? So if they need help to do this, do you have staff that can receive that information or talk it through with them over the telephone? Can you can you make sure that that is accessible for working with people who want to raise feedback in a variety of formats? And then it's making sure that you have someone who's identified, so a key person who's responsible for investigating the complaints, so receiving them, investigating them, handling them, and then feeding back, as we mentioned, to the relevant people. And so the CQC are very clear that they want to have assurance that all of their complaints are thoroughly investigated, action is taken where necessary, and where you've identified failures, you've then responded to them in a correct and proportionate manner. So in a nutshell, those are the two pieces of legislation, or the two fundamental standards that underpin this particular key question. So all the time you're thinking, what's the information we're receiving? Can people provide this information to us in an accessible way? What are we doing with it? How are we driving change? And then how are we communicating with people that such changes have been made for the better? So I'd say that's kind of the key, in a nutshell, that's that quality statement for you. So if we move on to the next slide, what we've got here is so I've sort of done this a little bit differently to the other webinars. So under the quality statements, there's always multiple parts of subtopics that the CQC want to then explore with you, and that they want you to have a think about. So there are, in part 1, 2 and 6, there are 6 parts to this quality statement. What I would say is that for parts 1 and parts 2 and 6, you can refer back to webinars 5 and 6. Because of time today, we don't always have the time to go into every single subtopic of the quality statements. So for parts 1, 2 and 6, you can have a look at previous webinars, and I know that when you receive the slides, these will be links that you can then click directly onto to access the webinars and have a look at them. And that's because they're looking specifically at your governance, your management and your sustainability systems. So making sure that you've got consistent and clear approaches to measure outcomes and impact. And then when we look at partnerships and communities, which we covered last month, there are then, this covers the subtopics here, looking at making sure that you're involving the people using the service, their families, any carers involved, and any other external relationships that you have with stakeholders to drive innovation, to drive improvement, and to make sure that you are working with the most up-to-date and best practice guidance. So those three parts we did cover in the other webinar, so I'd encourage you to go back and have a look at those, and then we'll look at the other three parts now for you. So part 3, we can see here that the CQC are saying within this quality statement that there are processes to ensure that learning happens when things go wrong, and from examples of good practice, and that leaders encourage reflection and collective problem solving. So the key here is really about your role as a leader and how you're encouraging reflection and collective problem solving as a team. Again, it's something that we see when things go wrong, that often things have been done in isolation. So improvements may have been made behind the scenes, and colleagues are then simply told what the updates are. This is what we're doing. This is a non-negotiable. This is how things will look now. What they haven't done is take on board feedback from the wider team about what could be the best way to move forward. So it's really important that you do tap into your workforce, the skill set they've got, the resources that they could offer you, the knowledge they have that you might not know about, and make sure that you are working together to solve any issues. So the extracts that we've got on the screen, for those of you who haven't joined in the webinars before, these are from the CQC reports from September, so from last month's data. Anything in green is a service that received a good rating, red is inadequate, orange would be requires improvement, and blue would be outstanding. So we can see here one GP practice who received an inadequate rating, so a low score under this particular quality statement under well led, and that's because the CQC found that on reviewing minutes of the meetings, so these were the practice meetings that they had, there was no evidence to demonstrate that any incidents or complaints had been discussed. So when we read further into the report, we know that incidents have occurred and we know that complaints have been received, but what they haven't then done is translate that into speaking to the whole workforce about it, and then having an audit and a governance process in place to manage them, to respond to them, and then to drive change. So that's a fairly, it sounds obvious, but it's something that we see very often, is where these practice meetings aren't utilised as best as they could be. So making sure that you do have a good team meeting, a good practice meeting system in place, and that your workforce are aware of everything that's going on within reason, obviously, across the business. But then positively, we've got 2 examples from GP practices who had good ratings in this particular area. So leaders were able to describe that whilst embedding processes, they now reviewed the effectiveness of what had been implemented and then explored ideas for further improvement. So they described this as a continual and evolving process, and leaders demonstrated a comprehensive understanding of how to improve. There's not much I need to say there. That's a pretty robust and confident statement that that they do have an evolving process to manage improvement and innovation across the practice. So that's really positive. And then we can see an example here, so where the inspection team highlighted some issues. So the CQC have come out and identified some particular issues. The positive thing is that they were investigated and acted upon by the service. So some of the changes would have been acted upon immediately, and you'd often see that in a CQC report, where the CQC will say this was addressed while we were on site, or this was addressed as part of the inspection process. Some of them, it may be that they have to be, they take slightly longer to improve upon, but the CQC will then do follow-up work with the provider to make sure that that has been managed. So here in particular, there were some medications that were paused for some patients until they were reviewed, and where other issues were found relating to simple anomalies, then these were also managed by the practice. So they aren't, you can see obviously that they're not huge things that take a significant amount of time to do. They can be rectified quite easily, but the main thing is that the CQC have identified them, and then the provider has responded to them, and hopefully now they've embedded their own assurance processes that will make sure that those things are picked up on again in the future. So if we move to the next slide here, we've got part 4, and this specifically is looking at staff being supported to prioritise time to develop their skills around improvement and innovation. There is a clear strategy of how to develop these capabilities, and staff are consistently encouraged to contribute. So we talked earlier about the importance of partnership working, collaborative problem solving. It's really something, and you can see by the the colours on the screen here, we've got services that have had inadequate and requires improvement scores under this area. It really is something that we don't see enough of, and it, you know, it's a huge shame, but it's also demonstrating non-compliance from a CQC perspective. And everybody knows it's difficult to find protected time, to schedule in protected time for development and for learning, and it's, you know, it can feel like additional work to then get everybody on board. It's one of those, and I'm sure Claire will be able to talk about it in a little bit more detail with her experience. It's often one of those things that feels like hard work to begin with, but the more you do it, the easier all of your processes become as a result. So it's what's that saying, short-term pain, long-term gain, I think is probably the best way to approach this. And if you do need any suggestions or ideas on how to explore this area in more detail, then, you know, the well-led provider is definitely the right platform for this. So we've got some examples here from reports. So we can see here the CQC have reported there were limited opportunities for staff development, and staff had not been given time for training during working hours. So that's immediately a concern. That would be, and that's been given an inadequate rating by the CQC. The same practice, so this actually is another extract from the same clinic underneath in red, is feedback from staff highlighted they were unable to develop their roles due to time constraints and not being given protected time. Staff informed us they were expected to do updates in their own time. Staff told us that learning from complaints and significant events were not shared, and evidence provided confirmed this. So the CQC could see that that anything that occurred, so complaints, significant events, any incidents that happened across the service, they weren't being shared with the wider workforce. And on reviewing the minutes, we found no evidence to demonstrate that anything had been discussed. So you'll know, hopefully those who have joined in the webinars before, we often talk about triangulating all of the evidence that you gather. So this here is the perfect example of where we've got that the paperwork, so the policies, the procedures, the minutes and the record keeping don't demonstrate compliance, and then as a result staff have also confirmed this, which means that the CQC can be really clear that that is a poor rating. If, for example, staff were to say that it hadn't been discussed but actually the minutes showed otherwise, then there would be a different conversation around why staff aren't aware of these discussions. Why don't staff recall the meetings that have taken place, or do staff have an opportunity to read the minutes if, for example, they're not able to attend the meeting? But here it's really clear that the two parts haven't been ticked, and therefore the CQC can clearly rate that with a low score. And then interestingly, we've got one, sorry, if you go back one, yeah, thank you, from a requires improvement rating. So this is where we can see that regular team meetings were held and risks were discussed and actions were allocated to staff regarding learning. However, not all were clearly documented to demonstrate when, where and who was present and when this occurred, or what matters had been progressed and resolved. So again, this is a perfect example of when we talk about closing the loop, making sure that everything follows in a sequence to demonstrate learning lessons. The provider has started with all the right intentions, so they've had the team meetings, they've discussed certain issues, but what they haven't done is then follow up on that with next steps, and that's what the CQC are looking for. So the last part that we've got is part 5 out of the 6, and this here, the CQC again are wanting to see leaders encouraging staff to speak up with ideas for improvement. So the collaborative problem solving, the partnership working, it's all of those things coming in here. So they want to see staff being able or encouraged to speak up with ideas for improvement and innovation, and that leaders are actively investing time to listen and engage with them. And there's a strong sense of trust between leadership and staff. That's something that can definitely be captured through your staff surveys, through team building exercises, through obviously the well-led provider, which Claire will talk about a little bit later. But there are ways to capture this information so that you as a leadership team can feel really, really assured that your staff do trust you, and that there is that circle, that cycle of communication, that they feel they can come to you, they feel they're listened to, they feel they're heard, and they feel that you are actually taking on board their suggestions for improvement and using that information in the best way. So an inadequate rating here for a service that the CQC were unable to gain assurances that the systems had been implemented by the caretakers during the period of time that the GP partners were away from the practice. And so the processes weren't followed and they weren't being used to ensure continuity and sustainability of services. And so again, that demonstrates that there isn't a strong sense of trust between the workforce. And so that relationship is breaking down essentially. But positively, we've got a good rating. So systems were in place for staff to provide feedback and to encourage staff to provide feedback and contribute to improvement initiatives. And then the staff have confirmed this by saying some staff we spoke to commented that significant improvements had been made since our last inspection and as a result of the feedback they provided. So again, we can see the full loop happening there. So if we move on to the next slide, this is just some top tips that we've put together for you. When we think about the quality statement, we mentioned on the very first slide, it's made up of 3 elements. So it's learning, improvement and innovation. Now, we'll probably feel quite confident with the words learning and improvement, but sometimes the word innovation can catch us thinking, what exactly does that mean? How do we demonstrate that? And we know that innovation can mean different things to different people. The CQC specifically define it as covering both invention, so the creation of a product, and the adoption, so the implementing of the product that has been created. So those are the 2 ways in which the CQC talk about innovation. And we know that it's crucial that health and social care systems are good at both, at creating and adopting or implementing new ideas, new initiatives, new products to solve problems and essentially improve the outcomes and the quality of care that people receive. So one way that I've always looked at innovation, particularly when kind of out on inspections and when working with providers, is as a storytelling approach. To avoid overthinking it, we often look at the elements that make up a story. If you have a quick look online, you'll see that there are the 5 fundamental things that any story needs to be successful, and that is to have a character, a conflict, a plot, a setting and a theme. So when we think about innovation and how you as a provider can demonstrate that you are being innovative and that you are thinking about new ideas, products, and implementing best practice, first of all, have a think about, from a character perspective, your workforce, your stakeholders, your patients, your service users, essentially anybody that's accessing or using the product that the regulated activity that you're providing. So do your processes and your policies make it clear who the stakeholders are or were, who was involved, so who has contributed to this learning event. So if something's taken place, who has been a part of it, whether that be the person that was affected by the incident, a staff member that might have been present when it happened, something that's gone wrong across the team, something that's gone well. So thinking about who's contributed to this learning event, the doing and the receiving of this, and that can involve many, many stakeholders. So once you're clear who the character is within this storytelling, think about what is the potential conflict, i.e. what's happened that's led you to needing to invent or adopt, change, drive improvement, drive quality. There will always be something that has happened to make you then think, oh, hang on a minute, this could be better, this shouldn't have necessarily have happened, or we'd never considered this could happen, but now it's happened, we don't want it to happen again. So that would be classed as your conflict. You're thinking about what did you all learn from the incident or the event that took place. So you've got the who, you've got the conflict. Then you can think about the plot. So how are you evidencing the sequence of events from beginning to end? This is very much from your paperwork. So your incident logs that you have, your audits that take place. If you're capturing staff kind of when an incident does occur, you might capture feedback from staff who were present, what happened, what was your take on the events. You'd absolutely be capturing feedback from the person who was affected by the incident, so the patient, the resident, the service user, whoever's at the other end of that, so to speak. But yeah, you want to be making sure that you're evidencing the sequence of events that took place, and how are you showing that all of the events have been connected to reach the desired outcome. So that's what we spoke about earlier. When we think about audit, we think about closing the loop, everything coming full circle. You need to make sure that if something has happened and you've then received that information, you've done something about it, you've made a change, you've evaluated the change, you know the change works, or you've created or implemented a new product, you've assured yourself through audits and through ongoing monitoring that that new and innovative product works. You've then captured new feedback to demonstrate that it works and that people are happy with it. That's how you're showing that all of the parts are connected to reach the desired outcome. The settings, so they're the logistics. Again, when we talk about the paperwork, making sure that you've captured the time and the place where something took place, what was the lesson that was learnt. So they're probably more of just the fairly fundamental, the black and white pieces to a puzzle that you would need to document. And then there's a theme that we always want to see throughout a story and throughout when we're thinking about innovation. So what's the key message that's woven throughout your governance processes and systems as a result of this incident that has taken place? So is it that your end goal, or the golden thread throughout that, is to improve safety for people? Was it, for example, to enable better access to care? Was it that you were considering better outcomes for particular groups of people, particularly if you're looking at patient participation groups, and the feedback you've received is that certain groups of patients feel they can't access care in a way they'd like to, or you're working in a residential setting and you're looking at potentially engaging with other people in the community, or expanding your service user bands, or working with different people. So was it that you're looking to provide better outcomes for particular groups, or were you thinking about how we can improve staff morale, passion, dedication to their work, because that's an area that's not going well? So I hope that makes sense in terms of a suggestion of how to think about innovation. When you're looking at your paperwork, when you're looking at the conversations you're having with your team, with other stakeholders, with people accessing care, I often think if you use those 5 elements and you feel confident that you have told a story using those 5 key points, it can be you will then be able to easily demonstrate innovation to the CQC and obviously improve outcomes for everybody. So then the next couple of slides, we're just recapping quickly on the learning and improvement elements of the quality statement. So we've looked at innovation, learning and improvement. As I've said, I think that most people here will be quite confident with kind of what that means and how that could look. But what we've done is, again, signpost you back to the previous webinars that we've done so far, and looking at some of the top tips or some of the feedback that we've had from those of you on the call in terms of best practice that you've done, suggestions that you've had, or questions that you've raised. So in order to demonstrate learning and improvement, when we did webinar 1, we looked at shared direction and culture. So this is asking yourselves really as leaders, have you provided opportunities for staff and patients to express their views and concerns? So you're looking at your feedback process. Do you have a process in place to ensure you listen and act upon this feedback to shape the service and the workforce culture? So it's really important there that you're looking at the shared direction, shared visions and values and culture of your service. Webinar 2, we focus specifically on capable, compassionate and inclusive leaders. So one of the questions or the suggestions that came up were that in your accident and incident logs, where you then document lessons learned, where do you as a leader record your involvement in these, and where do you then show that you have identified learning for yourself? Again, that's often a shortfall that we might see when we're out inspecting services, that you as a leader have talked about what everybody else did. So staff member A did or didn't do this, staff member B did this, the service user or the patient was affected in this way, but there's often very little reflection back at yourself about what you as a leader could have done better or differently, and what you will then do moving forward to contribute towards improved outcomes. Webinar 3, we looked at freedom to speak up, which is one of the new quality statements that the CQC have introduced, and we looked specifically at the Francis report, and we identified that principle 10 of this report highlights the importance that every member of staff should receive training in their organisation's approach to raising concerns. So just asking yourself again, do you have your freedom to speak up policies and processes in place? Do you provide this at your service? So go back, have a look at that webinar and refresh yourself with the freedom to speak up requirements that are now involved from a CQC point of view. Webinar 4, we looked at workforce equality, diversion and inclusion. So something that came up is, does your recruitment process enable you to recruit based on values amongst other key and essential requirements? So we know that you're recruiting based on qualifications, you know, probably particular training that may have been done, but are you recruiting on a value base as well? And it's really thinking about how you can invest in that for future recruitment. And do you ensure that staff have training for mandatory topics, which can also include training on value bases? So it's again going beyond the essential and mandatory requirements that we know you need for every role, such as safeguarding, infection control, and then looking at actually how can we incorporate equality, diversion, inclusion, and the values of the business in our training and in our recruitment. Webinar 5, we looked at governance, management and sustainability. And as I've mentioned before, Regulation 17, hopefully everybody's favourite regulation by now, discusses the necessity for providers to have access to all the information in order to learn lessons. Really important here that you, as a provider, have information, everything that you need in order to understand a scenario and then to drive improvement. What we don't want to see is that, oh, so-and-so has that part of the incident log, or so-and-so accesses all of that. That's their role to do. If you are the provider, the registered manager, the practice manager, the clinical lead, whoever's responsible for looking at lessons learned and driving improvement, you need to have access to all of the information. And then last month we looked at partnerships and communities. So specifically we were talking about whether or not you have tapped into local knowledge and resources. So that could include inviting relevant stakeholders into the service as guest speakers, to discuss topics, to share information, and that will then contribute to how to your research and your learnings, and that will then contribute towards your innovation and your learning and improvement initiatives. So we'll move on to the hot seat now, but hopefully that's a hopefully a helpful summary of that particular quality statement, and will encourage you to have a look back at the previous webinars, because as I've said, learning, improvement, innovation really does cover most of the things, or we come across it in most of the other conversations that we have when we're looking at CQC compliance. So we've got Gary and Ketan, I can see them both on the screen. So question number 1 that we're going to put to Gary with our practice manager hat on is, looking back over this webinar series, are there any creative ways of driving improvement that you have encouraged providers to adopt?
Okay, thanks, Gabby. There's a few things I'd probably say on this. I think that make it a constant conversation. You know, it's very easy, I think, as a practice manager, I'm sure I was guilty of this, that there would just be certain times that you'd ask about, you know, what could we do better and things for improvement. So I'd be making it a constant conversation, and also making sure that you're asking everybody. I always found that, you know, the receptionists, the administrators, the secretaries, you know, everybody in the wider team had their own thoughts, and if they were closer to it, often the best ideas about how to improve things. So I'd make it a conversation, and I'd ask everybody in the team. I also, when I was in practice, we instilled the sort of mindset of that we're going to try things. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect. We don't have to have all the answers, but we're going to constantly try things as well. And I think it's important to measure as well what's happening. So, you know, when I was in practice, we always had a big sort of set of KPIs that we used, just so you know what's working and what isn't working, where you need to improve. So I think, you know, having the mindset we're going to try things, doesn't have to be perfect, and we're going to make sure we measure and find out what's going on, accept that things can fail, accept that you might not have all the answers, that sort of whole uncertainty, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And I've always found that sometimes, you know, GP partners, they want it to be perfect. They want to know all the answers before they try it. But it doesn't have to be like that. You know, accept that uncertain, imperfection, you know, and give things a try. And the other thing I'd say as well, I came into practice from the retail and the optometry worlds. Look outside the practice. You know, I'm a school governor, and I've found things that work in the education side that I've been able to bring into practice. So look beyond primary care and general practice for ideas as well. It's amazing what you can find. So I think that's how I'd answer that one, Gabby. Hope that helps.
Brilliant, thanks Gary. Yeah, that's great, and I think absolutely the word I liked that you said about measuring progress, impact, whether or not something works, that's really, really key. It's absolutely fine, as Gary said, if you introduce something and it doesn't work, that's fine. But if you've measured it and you can then demonstrate why it didn't work, and actually that will then help you identify what it is that's missing from that particular thing that you've introduced, you then know what you're looking for next, don't you? It's a bit like sort of shopping in that sense. You keep looking, but you narrow down what it is that you need, the more that you try, even if it doesn't work. So yeah, thank you, Gary. Katan, you've got research questions. Research is beneficial to health and social care professionals, which we know, who can develop imaginative solutions for real problems, improve care and increase job satisfaction. For a service who are unsure where to start with undertaking or being part of a research project, what tips can you give?
So I think it's really important to first recognise that where are the key areas in your organisation that you actually need to look into. That there's little point doing research for the sake of doing research. And so you need to look back at your audits, your patient feedback, or kind of any kind of staff observations. And that should maybe start the basis of actually where you might want to approach other organizations to collaborate with. So local universities, research organizations, most of us will have local academic health science networks that we can reach out to, and they're always looking for somebody to collaborate with, especially in primary care, because there are so many patients and that's quite difficult to get hold of. And once you can get involved in that, you can actually, perhaps if you have the capacity to, have somebody assigned in your organization who is your research lead, and they get familiar with the protocol and how they're actually going to collaborate with that organization and put it into place. I'm also aware that in general practice, for example, you can actually, in EMIS, for example, I'm sure it's the same in others like System 1, actually have yourself open to being approached about research as well, because organizations are often looking for this as well. So there are plenty of opportunities. And then it can build up into something such as looking at research grants and so on with the National Institute for Health Research as well. And that gets into much bigger projects. You start developing this culture after a while of improvement, looking into what could be better. And I think that can only be positive for everybody else, because it just kind of changes the mindset of always thinking about, could something be done differently? Or could we be part of something that actually brings about some sort of significant change?
Brilliant, thanks Ketan. Yeah, that's really, really helpful. And I think, yeah, absolutely, do not do research for the sake of it. You know, it needs to be personalised, bespoke, and something that will absolutely benefit your service at a local level. So yes, it's worth thinking about that when you're thinking about lessons that you've learned, and then how research could help you drive that improvement that we've talked about. So Gary, as a practice manager, how did you document lessons learned, and how was this approach received by the CQC? So when you had inspections, and is there anything that you would have done differently?
And Gary, I think it's that last part. What would I do differently? Because if I look back and think back about how we did things, I don't think it was great or anything special or anything different. I think that, reflecting on it, I think, we did all the things that probably everybody does. We had this SEA meetings, complaint reviews, filled out all the templates, put them away, on GP TeamNet or a shared drive, and we ticked a box. We very much ticked a box. And I think that's a lot of the problem. You adopt the mindset of, I'm ticking a box and I'm not actually gaining anything from it other than ticking a box. So looking back, I think what I would do differently, I think firstly, I'd encourage, rather than what lessons have we learned, I'd encourage what knowledge have we gathered, because there feels to me just something that doesn't always motivate people, encourage people about the whole lessons learned bit. So, I think in bigger organisations, you'll have knowledge libraries and, departments that deal with managing the knowledge. So I think I'd be sort of talking about it as what knowledge have we gathered. And I think there's three parts to it. I think there's the gathering the knowledge part, and on the well-led website, if you sign up, there are some great reflection templates you can use. So I think the starting point is, you know, whether it's an SEA or complaint, let's do a proper reflection on this with everybody involved, with the whole practice as a group, and actually, you know, gather the knowledge. Okay, it's the lessons that you're learning, but let's gather the knowledge from that. I think then for me, needed to be better at storing that knowledge. It needs to be somewhere better than, you know, dusty folders or shared drives that nobody knows where they are. And I think, Gabby, you've said in previous webinars that, you know, one person says they're in one place and another person says they're another. I think there needs to be a very good place that's easy to search, you know, whether it's using tags or titles that can easily be searched. Everybody knows about it. And then the last part is the sharing of it, because again, it tends to get put away and forgotten about. And for me, it always worked best in practice when I delegated responsibility to somebody. And that could be a receptionist, administrator, it could be a nurse or a HCA, but whatever role. Delegate that responsibility for sharing the knowledge, making sure everybody knows where the knowledge is, how to find what they want and sharing it. So, you know, I think there's three parts to what I would do better. I'd be gathering it better using maybe reflection templates. I'd be storing it better using tags so it's easy to find, everybody knows about it, and I'd be sharing it better, probably with somebody having some responsibilities.
Brilliant, thanks, Gary. No comments for that one. That was really, really helpful. Thank you. And then Ketan, last question. So again, talking about the benefits of research and how this can then impact people from an outcomes perspective. So patients looking at earlier diagnosis, effective treatments, prevention of ill health, and faster returns to everyday life. So have any recent research publications informed your practice in relation to improved outcomes for people? It's a tough question.
It is, and actually, I think this is this goes back a little bit wider to access. So in primary care, especially, we are held to account over access, and so that it is about the number of appointments rather than maybe what the value of those appointments are. And obviously, we have non-GP staff as well who form an integral part of the team. But if you become obsessed only with access, does that actually improve healthcare outcomes? There was quite a significant analysis earlier in the year by Cambridge University talking about the continuity of care and what impact that actually has on patient outcomes. And having looked at kind of millions of consultations over a long period, they found that actually those that had continuity of care tended to have a longer time period before they needed to go back to their practice, and had better health outcomes as well. And obviously it's not a linear process, it will vary from person to person, but I think it just highlights the importance of continuity of care, which is obviously really difficult to implement when you're trying to provide adequate access. But perhaps that actually recognises that if you have continuity of care, you're less likely to perpetuate the issue of access difficulties more than anything else. And so that's where general practice has such a significant role to play.
Great, thanks, Ketan. And interestingly, for those CQC people out there, that is one of the new quality statements under the key question of responsive is looking at continuity of care. So it's obviously something that, you know, we're recognising has a benefit for people as well from a CQC point of view. So that's great, thank you. I will now hand over to Claire.
Thank you, Gabby. Just conscious of time, I'm wondering whether I go to the audience now and see whether we've got any questions. I can't see any in the chat, but I want to give you the opportunity to pop some in if you'd like to. Bearing in mind, of course, that you've got all of our email addresses, so you can email us with questions at any time, and we will, of course, try our best to answer them. I think my reflections from that are trust. I didn't realise how much of an emphasis trust had even in this quality statement, which is about learning, improvement and innovation. Trust doesn't automatically jump out. But at the same time, of course it does, because if you haven't got trust in your team, it's that kind of foundation building block, then you're never going to learn, improve or innovate. When it comes to seeking staff feedback, if you use our resources on our platform, then your staff are given the opportunity to say whether they feel the trust levels are high in your organisation, whether they trust their line manager, that kind of thing. And if if that's coming up as an issue, then that needs to be focused on before anything else. The trust has to be the kind of first thing that you tackle. And we have lots of resources on our platform that you can then dig into, and exercises that you can do to help build the trust levels in your organisation. We also have some resources and exercises about running effective meetings, which Gabby picked up on earlier, was a common thread that we see in these inspection reports, that meetings haven't been as effective as they could be. One of the things seems to be about action planning and making it specific who and by when people are doing things and what exactly they're doing. And then following this whole process through. So, for example, if it's a significant event meeting, following it through and making sure that learning points and minutes are disseminated to all members of staff, but then it doesn't just stop there. The CQC will then go and check that staff have actually picked up on what those learning points are from the minutes. So every single little bit of detail in your loop that we keep talking about, you have to have some evidence for and be prepared to answer to the CQC for. For example, with that one, them going out to your staff and saying, what have you learned recently from the significant event reviews that the practice has done? If we look specifically at learning improvement and innovation, these are some of the types of questions that we ask your staff to give feedback on our platform. Are you making good decisions? Are you making those based on evidence rather than people's opinion, or on data that you've got, for example, appointments data, or are you just saying, oh, I think we should do an extra 20 appointments on Tuesday for no reason? We ask staff if they're adequately involved in shaping any changes to the practice, and we ask staff specifically with that last one if they are aware of significant events and learning points that have been come out of those events. And then on the right hand side of that slide, there's an example of some of the types of resources and exercises that we've got on the platform that you can then go away and do, and say that you're doing in an action plan, and then reflect on how you've done, and then hopefully speak to your staff again and show that things are better, and thus give some evidence to the CQC that you're constantly working on your well-led and improving and innovating, seeking feedback, acting on the feedback, which is something under Regulation 17 that the CQC now says that we must be doing. You're going to get these slides anyway, but these are all links that you can click on if you want to find out how much it would cost to use our platform at your organisation. Essentially, for practices, it's 10p a patient or less, depending on your list size. The more patients you've got, the cheaper per patient it becomes. And there are lots of options depending on how much and how long you'd like to use our resources for, monthly to 2 yearly. And you can buy just little bits if you're not interested in having a subscription to our practice. We also have our services that I touched on earlier, including the workshops that Gary runs and the mock CQC inspection that Gabby is in charge of. We have 2 and 1 day inspections depending on what you're looking for. And Ketan and I, with our mediator hats on, also do mediation for practices that have some conflict in them that needs to be resolved. So on that note, I'll sort of close that part of the webinar. And